I want you to imagine your perfect place. Maybe it's a beach. Maybe it's the mountains. Maybe it's a particular house or home or building. For me, it's a lake house with white birch trees lining the shore and a dock that extends out over the water. It's a summer evening, and the heat of the day is given way to a cool breeze flowing off of the water. Imagine your perfect place. Get it fixed in your mind. And then I want you to think about a party in that place. Maybe it's an outside party. Lights are strung in the trees. There's large bonfires for people to gather around. The smell of grilled or smoked meats fills the air, and as you look down the table, all of your favorites are there, all of your favorite foods and drinks. And the sound is a sound of laughter, merriment of a great crowd gathered together in celebration. Maybe your party's a little different, maybe your party's a little fancier, maybe it's a little bit more low-key, but I want you to imagine a perfect party in your perfect place. And then I want you to think about who is there with you. Family and friends, yes. A favorite neighbor, a coworker that perhaps you wonder who let him in, but there he is nonetheless. And most amazing of all, a loved one, a spouse, a parent or grandparent, a child who died years ago and yet somehow is there, healthy and strong and with a smile from ear to ear. And so you start to look around and you see other people who had died, other people who you thought you had lost, a childhood friend, a college roommate you lost touch with, even a beloved pet. They're all there at this incredible party. It's your perfect place. I want you to imagine what that would be like. Get it fixed in your mind, the who and the what and the where. Smell the smells, hear the sounds, see all the sights of this incredible reunion. And now hear the words of Jesus. I go to prepare a place for you. The place Jesus is preparing for you is a place of rich foods and aged wine. It's a place where all of the saints of God, everyone who has died in Jesus, will be reunited, and God himself will dwell with his people. It's a place where laughter is the native tongue and tears will be no more. A place where death is undone and all things are made new. And here's the best part. That place that you imagine, the who and the what and the where of the great feast and what it will be like at the reunion, at the new creation, that place in your mind is but a shadow of what God is preparing for you. It's like the reflection of a mountain in a lake or an impressionistic painting. You can kind of see the contours, you get an idea of what the shapes are like, but then you look up and you see the real thing. That's what that day is going to be like. More vivid, more real, and more than you or I could possibly imagine. And a word of caution, because if you're anything like me about now, as soon as you start to dream in this way or let your heart hope in this kind of way, there's a voice in the back of your head that says, it's not going to be like that. Nobody can know what it's going to be like. It's just wishful thinking. You're fooling yourself. But to borrow from author John Eldredge, do you really want to suggest that sinful man can create stories and imagine worlds that outshine the world God will remake? or perhaps a better authority, the Apostle Paul. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. And so, my friends, let your sanctified imagination run wild. Stake everything, every dream, every longing, every heartache, every hope on the promise of our resurrected King who says, I go to prepare a place for you. This Easter, we're taking a look at Peter's first letter to the church in a series called Living Hope. And it's this hope of a home, of a place for God's people that Peter points us to in chapter 2. Becky read these verses for us a few minutes ago. I invite you to read them with me again, verses 4 and 5. We read together. As you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter uses this metaphor of a building, of a house or a home, to describe the hope that the first Christians and you and I have in Jesus. And I have to say, it's a little strange. It's kind of an odd move that Peter makes, at least on the surface, because in the very first verse of his letter, you might remember a couple weeks ago, Pastor Jordy preached about this. In the very first verse of his letter, and multiple times in between, Peter acknowledges the fact that those who are reading his words, the first Christians and you and me, he acknowledges that we're strangers, we're sojourners, we're aliens and exiles. And by definition, a stranger and an exile is far from home. Perhaps you know this, but it wasn't exactly easy to be a Christian in the first century. The best a Christian could hope for in the first century was to be seen as odd or strange or different. I mean, who has one God? There are lots of gods you can choose from. You don't need to limit yourself. And whose God is crucified? That's strange. And no one rises from the dead. To be a Christian was at best to be seen as strange and different. And at worst, it was to be viewed as dangerous, as subversive, as a threat to respectable society that needed to be stamped out and destroyed. And so it was routine for Christians to be driven from their homes, from their businesses, from their cities. They were quite literally exiles. And of all the things you can say about an exile, perhaps more than anything else, an exile longs for and hopes for a place to call home. Maybe even to go back to the place where they had belonged. And even though as American Christians living in the 21st century, we don't face those kinds of pressures and persecutions, there is still a very real sense in which you and I are exiles and strangers in this world. It's more subtle. It's not as obvious as it was in the first century or as it is today in other places in the world. And yet there are all sorts of ways that kind of clue us in to the reality that this world as it stands right now is utterly unlivable. That this world is not our home. You can see it when you weep as a loved one suffers, or when your heart breaks when he or she dies. It's the reason why your anger burns at the evil of war and human trafficking and racism and 100 other injustices that we're faced with every day. It's why our bodies and minds break down and the health and vigor of youth fades. It's why you're so scattered and stressed and just making life work every day is a burden more than you can bear. And it's why nothing quite satisfies. no matter what you try, no matter how hard or wide you search. The truth is, no one gets out of this life alive, intact and unscathed. We all bear heartache of one kind or another. This world as it is utterly unlivable. And so you and I need a new place. We need a true home. Because this place, this world, even as it is, even with the good and the comforts that we presently enjoy, this world is not the environment you and I were created for. We were created for Eden. We were created to be at home with God, apart from sin, apart from disease and war, apart from death. That's the type of place we were created for. And that is why Peter calls us sojourners and strangers and aliens and exiles. That's why we're lumped in with all of those searching for a real and true home. And that place, your seat at the great feast, the reunion that we all long for, home, it's already under construction. The first stone has already been laid. Earlier, Peter calls Jesus a living stone, rejected by men. Rejection and exile was a pattern in Jesus' life. You see it on the day he was born. No room for him in the inn. You remember that story? Wrapped in cloths and laid in a manger in an animal feed box. It wasn't his. Shortly after he was born, Jesus and Mary and Joseph had to flee as exiles to Egypt to escape the murderous plot of King Herod. In his ministry, Jesus wasn't welcome in his hometown. They actually tried to throw him off a cliff at one point. And when a disciple, or would-be disciple, came and tried to pledge himself to Jesus, our Lord said, well, foxes have dens and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's a pattern in Jesus' life, a pattern of rejection and exile that followed him all the way to the cross and to the tomb, where once again he was wrapped in cloths and once again laid in a borrowed place. Even in death, Jesus had no home, no place to call his own. And yet it is this stone, the one rejected by men, that is chosen and precious in the sight of God, because Jesus is the living stone. He is not dead, but he is alive again. God raised Jesus from the dead, and in Jesus, you too are called living stones. In Jesus, you too are chosen and precious in the sight of God. You too will rise again. For in Jesus, the foundation of your new home, of that place God is preparing for you, has already been laid. The first stone is set. We read again verses 6 and 7. Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is a cornerstone. Not just any cornerstone. This is the cornerstone from when our church building was over on Tesson. Shout out to Dana and to Ron and to Stephen for tipping me off that we actually had this in storage, that it was accessible, and for figuring out a way to get it up here on the platform, because as you can imagine, this is not exactly light. So I'm grateful for their help in this. A cornerstone, as you might know, is the first stone laid in a new building project. It is a stone around which all of the other stones and materials are oriented, are laid in reference to. A cornerstone is laid with the hope and the expectation of more, that one day the building will be complete and ready for use. This cornerstone was set in 1961 when our church was just 13 years old. And later this year, we're going to celebrate and give thanks to God for 75 years as a congregation. And so I'm pretty certain that the people who laid this stone, that there was no way they could have possibly imagined what God would make this church into, what this congregation would become. 2 different sites, 2 campuses, 5 different worshiping communities. Maybe they might have imagined a child care center, but not a theater ministry, not a health and fitness center, not a coffee house. They couldn't have imagined a church with outreach and influence and mission all across the St. Louis region. But I'm equally certain that this stone was laid in hope that there would be a people whose hope would be the firm foundation of Jesus Christ. That there would be a people who would assemble and sing the praises, the excellencies of him who has lavished abundant and limitless mercies on you. That the stone was laid in hope. You can see it here, Alpha and Omega. Someone pointed that out to me earlier, that the stone was laid in hope of a people who themselves would hope in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And the first stone of that world has already been laid. And no one who hopes in that stone will be disappointed. For Christ is risen. And he goes to prepare a place for you. Amen.